Case 1, Lindsey Brooke Lowe. September 12, 2011. Sumner County Criminal Court. There are moments in a criminal investigation when the evidence before investigators defies every assumption they carry into their work. Moments when the facts, laid bare inside a courtroom, force an entire community to confront a question that has no comfortable answer. How does something like this happen, and how did no one see it coming? The case of Lindsey Brooke Lowe is one of those moments. It is a case that began inside a quiet residential home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a suburb nestled approximately 20 miles northeast of Nashville, and it would ultimately travel through the Tennessee court system for more than a decade before the final chapter was written. Lindsey Brooke Lowe was, by all outward appearances, a young woman living an unremarkable life in a close-knit suburban community. She was in her mid-20s at the time of the events that would define the rest of her life. She lived with her parents. She maintained relationships with people around her. She kept a bedroom in the family home where she had grown up. Nothing about her external presentation suggested the secret she was carrying, a secret so profound, so devastating in its eventual revelation, that investigators and prosecutors would spend years trying to understand not just what had happened, but why. On the morning of September 12, 2011, the quiet of the Lowe family home was shattered by a discovery that no parent should ever have to make. It was Lindsey's father who found what was inside that room. Inside a laundry basket, an ordinary household object, the kind found in virtually every home in America, lay the bodies of two newborn infant boys. Twin boys. His grandsons. Children who had entered the world in secret and had never been given the chance to leave that room alive. What investigators pieced together in the hours, days, and weeks that followed was a story of concealment that was staggering in its completeness. Lindsey Lowe had carried her pregnancy without alerting anyone around her, without seeking hospital-based prenatal care that would have created a record, without telling family members, without making any of the preparations that typically accompany the arrival of a child. When the twins arrived, she was alone. And when they began to cry, as newborns do, as every infant does from the first breath, she made a choice. She pressed her hands against them to silence the sound. The medical examiner's findings would confirm that both infant boys died as a result of that act. Their small bodies were then placed inside the laundry basket, where they remained for several days while the household continued around them. The question that haunted this case from the very beginning was not simply what Lindsey had done. Courts and investigators deal with the mechanics of a crime through evidence and testimony. The deeper question, the one that lingered in the minds of those who followed the case, was the profound isolation that must have surrounded her for such a set of circumstances to unfold the way they did. That question would not be resolved by a verdict. It would remain in the community long after the proceedings concluded. Investigators from the Hendersonville Police Department and the Sumner County Sheriff's Office worked the scene with careful, methodical attention. The case was documented, the evidence was preserved, and Lindsey Brooke Lowe was taken into custody. She was charged in connection with the deaths of both infant boys. The case moved through the Sumner County criminal court system with the weight of its facts pressing on everyone involved. At trial, the prosecution presented evidence centered on the physical findings and on the timeline of events that investigators had constructed through their work in the home. The defense raised arguments that touched on Lindsey's mental state, her awareness, her capacity in those moments. These are arguments that courts weigh carefully, and the jury in this case weighed them. In 2013, the jury returned its verdict. Lindsey Brooke Lowe was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the legal story did not end with that verdict. In the years that followed her conviction, Lowe's legal team pursued an appeal centered on an issue that had nothing to do with the physical evidence of the case. The argument raised concerned juror bias, specifically whether members of the jury had been properly screened and whether the composition of that jury had been fair and impartial as required by the constitutional guarantees that govern every criminal proceeding in this country. It was a serious legal challenge, and it moved through the appellate system with the slow, deliberate pace that characterizes the post-conviction review process in Tennessee. In June of 2024, more than a decade after the original verdict, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals issued its ruling. The court reviewed the arguments, examined the record of the original trial, and considered the claims of juror bias that had been raised on appeal. The court's conclusion was clear. The convictions were upheld. The sentence remained. The legal process had run its course, and at every stage, the outcome had been the same. For the community of Hendersonville, and for the broader Nashville metropolitan area that had watched this case unfold across 13 years of proceedings, the appellate ruling represented a form of finality. The courts had spoken. The record had been reviewed. The accountability that the legal system provides had been delivered. The two infant boys at the center of this case, children who never received names in any public record, who never had the opportunity to grow and be known, remain the reason this case matters. Their existence, brief and hidden as it was, is the reason that investigators came forward, that prosecutors built their case, and that the courts spent years ensuring that the proceedings were conducted properly. Child protection advocates have long pointed to cases like this one as evidence of the need for expanded access to support services for individuals facing unplanned pregnancies, services that offer alternatives, that remove the isolation that can precede tragedy, and that create pathways toward help rather than desperation. Organizations dedicated to child welfare and family support are available across Tennessee and throughout the country. If you or someone you know is in a situation involving an unplanned pregnancy or a crisis involving a child's safety, resources exist. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services maintains a statewide hotline. Help is available, and reaching out is always the right choice. The justice delivered in the case of Lindsey Lowe came slowly and came hard. But it came. And for two small lives that never had the chance to be known by the world, the accountability established through more than a decade of legal proceedings is the only form of recognition the system can provide. If this case moved you, if it reminded you why this kind of documentary work matters, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode of Cold Case Hour. Case 2, Megan Boswell. On or about December 2019, Sullivan County Criminal Court. There is a particular kind of investigation that tests the patience and the resolve of law enforcement in ways that go beyond the standard challenges of building a criminal case. It is the investigation that begins not with a crime scene discovered by chance or reported by a witness, but with a question, a simple, agonizing question that no one can seem to answer. Where's the child? In Blountville, Tennessee, in Sullivan County, that question consumed investigators for weeks. And the answer, when it finally came, was one of the most sobering discoveries in the county's recent history. Evelyn Mae Boswell was 15 months old. 15 months. Old enough to have a personality, old enough to respond to her name, old enough to be known by the people around her. A child that age leaves impressions on the world. They are seen. They are held. They are part of the fabric of the daily life of whoever cares for them. Which is precisely why the circumstances surrounding Evelyn's disappearance were so deeply alarming from the moment investigators began to understand them. Megan Boswell, Evelyn's mother, did not report her daughter missing in December of 2019 when the child was last seen alive. She did not report her missing in January of 2020. She did not report her missing at all. It was not until February of 2020, 2 full months after anyone appears to have seen Evelyn alive, that law enforcement became aware that the child was gone. And even then, the notification did not come in a straightforward way. It came through a tangle of family communications and third-party reports that forced investigators to piece together a timeline from fragments. When investigators from the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation began speaking with Megan Boswell, they encountered something that would become a defining feature of this entire case: inconsistency. Story after story. Version after version. Investigators documented numerous conflicting accounts from Boswell as they worked to establish what had happened to her daughter and where Evelyn was. Each account raised more questions than it answered. Each version contradicted elements of what had come before. For the investigators working this case, the shifting narratives were not obstacles to the truth, they were part of the evidence. In criminal investigations, a pattern of deliberate misdirection tells its own story. The search for Evelyn Boswell became one of the most extensive child-focused investigations in Sullivan County's history. Law enforcement personnel, search teams, and volunteers covered significant ground as the days passed, and the question of where Evelyn was remained unanswered. The community held its breath. Across Tennessee, People who had been following the story through news reports waited for news that they hoped would not be what they feared it might be. When investigators finally located Evelyn's remains, they were found on property associated with the Boswell family. Specifically, inside a trash container housed in a shed on family land. The discovery confirmed what the investigation had been pointing toward for weeks. Evelyn Mae Boswell had not simply disappeared. She had been taken from the world, and her remains had been concealed in a manner that spoke to deliberate and calculated effort to prevent discovery. The question of exactly when Evelyn lost her life, and the precise chain of events that led to that outcome, became central to the prosecution's case. The medical and investigative evidence pointed to the period around December of 2019 as the time frame in which the child's life ended. The 2 months of silence that followed, the 2 months during which no report was made, during which investigators had no reason to search, during which a 15-month-old child's absence went unacknowledged in any official capacity, became a critical part of the legal proceedings. Megan Boswell was taken into custody and charged in connection with Evelyn's death. The case moved through the Sullivan County court system with the gravity that such proceedings demand. The legal process was extensive, as it often is in cases of this nature, and it involved not only the core charges related to Evelyn's death, but also additional charges that reflected the full scope of what investigators had established. The false statements given to law enforcement, the manner in which Evelyn's remains had been treated following her death. These were not minor ancillary matters. They were prosecuted as the serious offenses they represented. In February of 2025, Megan Boswell stood before a Sullivan County judge and received a sentence of life in prison. For the investigators, the prosecutors, and everyone who had spent years working toward this outcome, the verdict represented accountability delivered, the legal system functioning as it is designed to function when a child has been failed by the one person most responsible for protecting her. The legal proceedings did not conclude there. In September of 2025, the court returned to the case and imposed an additional 33 years to Boswell's sentence. These additional years addressed the charges related to the false reports given to investigators and to the conduct involving Evelyn's remains after her death. The court's message was unmistakable. Every aspect of what had occurred, every lie told, every obstruction attempted, every indignity visited upon Evelyn after her death, would be acknowledged and addressed within the framework of the law. Evelyn Mae Boswell deserved to be safe. She deserved the protection that every 15-month-old child is entitled to receive. Her case has been cited repeatedly by child welfare advocates as a demonstration of the critical importance of mandatory reporting requirements and of community awareness around child welfare. When a child that young disappears from the lives of people around them and no one asks questions, that gap is a systemic failure that communities and institutions must work actively to prevent. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains resources and reporting mechanisms for anyone with concerns about a child's safety or welfare. If you ever have reason to believe a child is in danger, reporting that concern to the appropriate authorities may be the most important thing you ever do. Evelyn's story does not end with a verdict. It ends with a responsibility. The responsibility of everyone who heard her story to carry it forward as a reason to protect the children around us with greater vigilance and greater care. If this case stayed with you, please like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this work going. Case 3, Cheyenne Maddox. July 6, 2022. Montgomery County Criminal Court. In the landscape of criminal cases involving the neglect of children, there are moments when the details presented in a courtroom reach a level of severity that leaves even experienced investigators and legal professionals searching for the right words. The case of Cheyenne Maddox and her son Kadaris is one of those cases. It is a case that unfolded not in the dramatic, sudden manner of some criminal incidents, but slowly, over a prolonged period, in a home where the conditions of daily life for one child bore no relationship to what the law, common decency, and basic human responsibility demand. Kadaris was 13 years old. He had cerebral palsy, a neurological condition present since birth that affects movement and motor function and that, depending on its severity, can require significant ongoing care and support. Children with cerebral palsy are not invisible in the systems designed to serve them. They interact with medical professionals. They receive therapy. They have needs that are documented and known to the institutions and individuals who are part of their lives. Qadari's had those needs. What he did not have, what the evidence in this case would establish beyond any reasonable doubt, was a caregiver who met them. The events that brought this case to the attention of law enforcement occurred on July 6, 2022, in Clarksville, Montgomery County, Tennessee. Clarksville sits approximately 50 miles northwest of Nashville, a mid-sized city with a population shaped significantly by its proximity to Fort Campbell. When investigators and medical professionals encountered Qadari's on that date, what they found was a child whose physical condition reflected not a sudden injury or a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged and systematic failure of care that had continued across an extended period. Qadari's weighed 35 pounds. 35 pounds. At 13 years of age. The medical professionals who documented his condition understood immediately that what they were seeing was the result of severe and prolonged deprivation of adequate nutrition. Investigators who examined the family home noted something that intensified the gravity of what they found. The kitchen was stocked with food. Adequate nutrition was available in that home. The food was there. Qadari simply was not being given access to it, was not being fed in a manner consistent with his needs, his age, or his medical condition. For investigators, the presence of food in the home was not a mitigating detail. It was an aggravating one. It transformed the question from one of poverty or scarcity into one of deliberate deprivation. The kitchen was full. The child was starving. Those two facts, placed side by side, told investigators everything they needed to know about the nature of what had happened in that home. Cheyenne Maddox was Qadari's mother. She was the person responsible for his care. She was the person who fed the household, who managed the environment in which her son lived, who made daily decisions about what Qadari's received and what he did not. The investigation established that she was the person responsible for the conditions that led to Qadari's death, because Qadari's did not survive. The 13-year-old boy who had lived his entire life with a physical condition that required attentive, compassionate care did not walk out of the situation that investigators encountered on July 6, 2022. He lost his life as a result of the severe neglect he had endured. The case against Cheyenne Maddox was built on the medical evidence documenting Qadari's condition, on the investigative findings from the home, and on the reconstruction of his daily circumstances over the period that led to his death. Montgomery County prosecutors filed charges that reflected the severity of what the evidence had established. The legal process moved forward with the methodical rigor that serious cases of this nature require. On February 11, 2026, Cheyenne Maddox was sentenced in Montgomery County Criminal Court. The court imposed a 20-year prison sentence on charges of reckless homicide and aggravated child abuse. The sentence reflected the court's assessment of the full scope of what had been established, not a single act of violence, but a prolonged course of conduct that caused a child to suffer and ultimately to lose his life in circumstances that were entirely preventable. 20 years. For Qadari's, who spent his life navigating the challenges of cerebral palsy and who deserved every resource and every accommodation and every warm meal that his condition required, the sentence represents the legal system's acknowledgement of how profoundly he was failed. Child welfare advocates who followed this case have pointed to it as a reminder of the importance of regular welfare checks, school attendance monitoring, and proactive engagement from medical providers who work with children who have disabilities. Children like Qadari's interact with systems, educational, medical, therapeutic, and those interactions represent opportunities for professionals to identify when something is wrong. When those systems work as intended, when every professional who interacts with a vulnerable child is asking the right questions and documenting the right concerns, the chances of a child's situation going undetected for a prolonged period are significantly reduced. Qadari's case is a call to action for every professional who works with children to take that responsibility with absolute seriousness. Qadari's deserve better. The court's verdict acknowledged that reality. The 20-year sentence is the legal system's answer to what happened in that Clarksville home. But the larger answer, the community answer, belongs to all of us, in the way we watch out for the children around us and refuse to look away when something does not seem right. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear these stories, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These cases matter, and your engagement helps us keep telling them. Case 4, Zohal Sakwall. August 16, 2010. Davidson County Criminal Court, Nashville. Nashville, Tennessee. A city of music, of culture, of community, and, like every city of its size, a place where the machinery of the criminal justice system sometimes turns in response to events that challenge everything a community believes about the bonds that hold families together. The case of Zohal Sakwall is a Nashville case in the fullest sense, investigated by Nashville law enforcement, prosecuted through the Davidson County court system, and ultimately resolved through a guilty plea that came nearly a decade after the events that set it in motion. The facts of this case begin in August of 2010. Zohal Sakwall had a daughter, a 4-month-old infant girl who was, by any measure, entirely dependent on her mother for everything. At 4 months old, a child has no capacity to protect herself, no ability to call for help, no way to communicate distress to anyone outside the immediate environment in which she lives. She is entirely, completely, and unavoidably vulnerable. That vulnerability is the reason the law places such a profound duty of care on the individuals responsible for infants. On August 16, 2010, that 4-month-old child lost her life. The manner in which she died, established through the investigation that followed and ultimately confirmed by Sakwall's own admission nearly a decade later, was suffocation. Sakwall had suffocated her infant daughter, and in the immediate aftermath of the child's death, she did not call for help and tell the truth about what had happened. She arranged the scene. She positioned the circumstances to suggest that the child's death had been an accident, a suffocation involving a blanket, the kind of tragedy that, while heartbreaking, does occur in homes with very young infants, and that investigators sometimes cannot rule out as accidental without significant additional evidence. The staging was sufficient to create ambiguity in the original investigation. The case moved forward without a clear determination of criminal liability. The infant girl was gone, and the precise truth of what had ended her life remained, for a period, in a space where certainty was elusive. But investigations do not always end when the original case closes. Cold cases, cases where the truth is suspected but not yet legally established, can remain open, can remain active in the minds of investigators who are not satisfied with the answers available to them. And the passage of time sometimes changes the landscape of a case. Witnesses reconsider. Evidence is reviewed with fresh eyes. People carry things they have not said for years, and sometimes those things eventually come out. In January of 2020, nearly 10 years after the death of her daughter, Zohal Sakwall confessed. She told investigators what she had done and why. The reason she provided was stark in its candor. She described her infant daughter as a disruption to her life. She had not wanted the child to be there, and she had taken action to remove that disruption. The confession, delivered a decade after the fact, gave investigators and prosecutors what the original case had lacked: a direct admission from the person responsible, in her own words, about what had happened and what had motivated it. The confession moved the case from the realm of cold investigation into the realm of active prosecution. Davidson County prosecutors moved forward with the charges that the evidence and the admission supported. Zohal Sakwall was charged with second-degree murder in connection with her daughter's death. In March of 2021, Sakwall appeared before a Davidson County judge and entered a guilty plea to the charge of second-degree murder. The court imposed a 15-year prison sentence. The plea and the sentence closed a chapter that had been open for more than a decade. A chapter that began with the loss of an infant girl who had been in the world for only 4 months, and who deserved the protection and love that every child is owed. For the Nashville law enforcement community and for the Davidson County Prosecutor's Office, this case is an example of what persistent, patient investigative work can yield. The original case presented challenges that could have led to its permanent closure without resolution. Instead, it remained open. When the confession came, the system was ready to respond. For the child at the center of this case, a 4-month-old girl whose name belongs to her family and whose memory belongs to those who loved her, the 15-year sentence is the law's recognition that her life had value, that what was done to her was wrong, and that accountability, even when it comes slowly, is not optional. Child advocacy professionals often point to cases involving infants as a reminder of the critical importance of postpartum support services and of the resources available to new parents who are struggling. The pressures of new parenthood can be profound. but help is available. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services, the National Parent Helpline, and community-based family support organizations exist precisely because the challenges of caring for a young child can feel overwhelming, and because there are always better options than the choices made in cases like this one. If this case resonated with you, if it moved you to think about the importance of child protection and community awareness, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Leave a comment below. Your voice matters in this conversation. Case 5, Brandi Elliott. July 13th, 2024. Sumner County Criminal Court. Some cases in the true crime documentary genre carry a particular weight, not because they are more complex than others, not because the legal proceedings surrounding them are more convoluted, but because the facts themselves are so immediate, so close in time to the present moment, that they carry the raw quality of something still unresolved. The case of Brandi Elliott and her 7-year-old daughter Piper is one of those cases. It is recent, it is active, and it is a case that a community is still in the process of reckoning with. July 13th, 2024. Hendersonville, Sumner County, Tennessee, the same community that appeared earlier in tonight's documentary in connection with the case of Lindsey Lowe. A community that, within a span of just over a decade, has found itself at the center of 2 cases involving the most profound failure of maternal responsibility that the law recognizes. Hendersonville is not a community defined by these cases. It is a community of families, of neighbors, of people living ordinary lives. But it is also a community that has had to confront, twice, the reality that the worst outcomes are not confined to distant places and unfamiliar names. Piper was 7 years old. 7 years old is an age of particular vividness in a child's life, old enough to have preferences and opinions and a personality that the people around her could recognize and describe. Old enough to have friends, to be known at school, to be someone that people remember. Piper was someone. She had a life, she had a world, and she had a mother. On July 13th, 2024, according to the investigation conducted by law enforcement in Sumner County, Brandi Elliott took Piper to Drake's Creek, a body of water in the Hendersonville area that, on any other day, would be associated with recreation, with the ordinary outdoor life of a Tennessee summer. On that day, investigators allege, Elliott held her daughter's head beneath the water until Piper stopped breathing, until the 7-year-old child who had been alive and present in the world that morning was gone. What followed the discovery of what had happened was the beginning of an investigation that moved quickly. Brandi Elliott did not deny what she had done. According to the accounts documented by investigators, she admitted to the act. And the reason she provided, the explanation she offered for what had occurred at Drake's Creek on that July afternoon, was that she felt overwhelmed, that she wanted to be left alone. Those words, offered in the context of a mother describing why she had ended her daughter's life, have stayed with everyone who has followed this case. They are words that speak to a state of mind, to a level of distress or detachment or something else that the legal process will ultimately work to define and to address. They are not words that explain, in any satisfying sense, what happened to Piper. No words could do that. But they are words that the court system will have to grapple with as this case moves forward. As of the production of this documentary, Brandi Elliott is being held in the Sumner County Jail. She faces charges of first-degree murder in connection with Piper's death. The case is pending. Trial proceedings have not yet concluded. The wheels of the Sumner County court system are turning, as they must, with the weight of this case pressing on every stage of the process. The presumption of innocence is a foundational element of the American legal system. Every individual charged with a crime is entitled to have their case heard in a fair and properly conducted proceeding. That principle applies here as it applies in every case. What investigators have documented, what charges have been filed, and what an admission may mean in the context of a formal legal proceeding. These are questions for the court. Cold Case Hour will continue to follow this case as it develops and will provide updates as the legal process reaches its conclusions. What can be said with certainty is this. Piper Elliott was a 7-year-old child who deserved to grow up. She deserved the summers and the school years and the friendships and the ordinary moments that make up a childhood. The legal process now underway in Sumner County is the system's way of establishing accountability for what happened to her. The community of Hendersonville, the broader Sumner County area, and everyone who has followed this case is waiting for that process to reach its conclusion. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis or parenting overwhelm that feels unmanageable, please reach out. The Tennessee statewide crisis line is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The National Parent Helpline can also connect callers with support and resources. Help is always available. The choice to reach out for that help is always the right one. Piper's story is not over. The case is not closed. And Cold Case Hour will be here to document every development as the legal process unfolds. If this case moved you, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share this documentary with someone who needs to hear these stories. The awareness you help create matters. Case 6, Shanynthia Gardner. July 1st, 2016. Shelby County Criminal Court, Memphis. To understand the magnitude of what occurred in Memphis, Tennessee, on July 1st, 2016, it is necessary to begin not with the act itself, because the act defies any easy framing, but with the silence that followed it. The silence inside a home. The silence that a single child, running as fast as his small legs would carry him, broke when he reached a place where he could call for help. That child, Shanynthia Gardner's eldest son, the one who escaped, may be the reason the story has an ending at all. Memphis, Shelby County. A major Tennessee city with a rich and complicated history, a vibrant cultural identity, and a community that has faced its share of profound challenges. On the first day of July, 2016, something happened inside a Memphis home that would alter the trajectory of the Gardner family forever and would send shockwaves through the local law enforcement and child welfare communities in ways that are still felt today. Shanynthia Gardner had 5 children. On that July afternoon, she subjected all 5 of them to an attack involving a knife. The youngest 4 children, all under the age of 5, did not survive. For children under the age of 5, the enormity of that fact is difficult to hold in the mind. It is the kind of case that investigators, seasoned professionals who have spent careers in law enforcement, describe as the hardest they have ever encountered. Not because the mechanics of the investigation were complex, but because of what they were asked to process as human beings while doing their jobs. For children under 5, the youngest among them would have had no capacity whatsoever to understand what was happening around them. They were entirely dependent, entirely trusting, and entirely unable to protect themselves from what occurred in that home. The one child who survived, Gardner's eldest son, did so because he ran. He got out of the home, and he called for help. His action, taken in the chaos of an unimaginable situation, is the reason that law enforcement arrived when they did. His testimony and his account of what he witnessed inside that home became part of the foundation of the investigation and the prosecution that followed. He is a survivor in every sense of that word, not merely a survivor of a physical event, but a witness to something that no child should ever have to carry. The investigation that followed was thorough and the evidence was substantial. The scene documented by first responders told a clear and unambiguous story about what had occurred inside that home. Shanynthia Gardner was taken into custody. The charges filed against her reflected the full scope of what had happened. The legal process in this case moved through the Shelby County court system over the years that followed. The case involved significant legal complexity, as such cases invariably do, with examinations of Gardner's mental state and history that are a standard and necessary part of proceedings involving crimes of this nature. Courts are required to ensure that individuals standing before them understand the proceedings and are legally responsible for their actions, and those examinations were conducted with the seriousness that the situation demanded. In February of 2022, nearly 6 years after the events of that July afternoon, the court reached its conclusion. Shanynthia Gardner was sentenced to life in prison. The court further specified the terms of that sentence. She would not be eligible for parole consideration until she had served 51 years. The sentence reflected the court's assessment of the gravity of what had occurred. For young lives lost, a surviving child left to carry the weight of what he had witnessed, and a family and community irrevocably changed. 51 years before parole eligibility. The mathematics of that sentence are meaningful. It is an acknowledgement from the court that what occurred on July 1st, 2016, was not something that the passage of a few years could address, or that any conventional sentencing framework could adequately account for. The 4 children who did not survive were each unique, each irreplaceable, and each owed a recognition by the courts that their lives had infinite value. Child mental health advocates and family wellness organizations have pointed to cases like this one as a reminder of the critical need for mental health resources and proactive support systems for parents who are struggling. Crisis intervention services, community mental health organizations, and family support networks exist to provide alternatives during moments of profound distress. If you or someone you know needs help, the Tennessee statewide crisis line is available around the clock, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline can connect individuals with local resources and support. The eldest son's courage, the courage it took to run, to call, to speak, is itself a form of heroism that the community of Memphis has not forgotten. He survived, and in surviving, he ensured that the people responsible for what happened that day would face accountability. The 4 children at the center of this case deserved everything the world had to offer them. The courts have done what the courts can do. The rest, the remembering, the advocacy, the determination to do better, belongs to all of us. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and help spread awareness about the importance of child protection and mental health support in our communities. Case 7. Ashley Lenal Crowder. July 28, 2017. Davidson County Criminal Court, Nashville. Nashville, Davidson County. The year, 2017. A July evening that began, as July evenings in Nashville do, with the particular heat of a Tennessee summer and the rhythms of city life moving forward in their ordinary way. What ended that evening? What was brought to an abrupt and devastating halt? Was the life of an 11-month-old boy whose injuries told a story that medical professionals were not able to ignore and that investigators would not be able to walk away from. The facts of the Crowder case were established through the painstaking work of medical professionals and law enforcement investigators working in concert, a collaboration that is often the backbone of cases involving very young victims who cannot speak for themselves. The 11-month-old child at the center of this case arrived at a Nashville medical facility on July 28, 2017. He was brought in by his mother, Ashley Lenal Crowder. The medical team that received this child immediately recognized that what they were seeing was far outside the range of injuries consistent with any kind of accidental event. The injuries the child had sustained were internal, severe, and extensive. Medical examiners and physicians working on the case used language in their assessments that communicated the gravity of what they were seeing. One description characterized the child's condition in terms that made clear to everyone in the medical facility that this was not the result of a fall, not the result of any kind of accident, but the result of deliberate and significant physical force applied to the body of an 11-month-old child. That child did not survive. He was 11 months old. 11 months. Barely long enough to have crossed the threshold from infancy into the earliest stages of toddlerhood, barely long enough to have accumulated the kind of memories that the adults around him might describe in detail years later. He was gone, and the medical evidence made clear how he had come to that point. Nashville Metropolitan Police Department investigators responded to the hospital. This is a standard protocol in cases where medical professionals have concerns that injuries to a child may not be accidental. A protocol that reflects decades of collaboration between healthcare systems and law enforcement to ensure that children who arrive at hospitals with suspicious injuries receive not just medical attention, but the full protective response of the investigative system. In this case, that protocol resulted in a thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding the child's injuries. Ashley Lenal Crowder was the child's mother. She was present. She had brought him to the hospital. The investigation focused on what had happened inside the home in the period before the child arrived at the medical facility and on establishing a clear picture of the circumstances that had led to the injuries documented by the medical team. The evidence developed through that investigation pointed directly to Crowder. The case proceeded through the Davidson County court system in the years that followed. The legal process involved the careful examination of the medical evidence, the investigative findings, and the full range of circumstances that prosecutors presented to support the charges that had been filed. It is a process that takes time, that demands thoroughness, and that ultimately reached its conclusion through a formal legal resolution. In September of 2021, 4 years after the events of that July night in Nashville, Ashley Lenal Crowder entered a guilty plea before the Davidson County Court. She pled guilty to second-degree murder. The court, having accepted the plea and considered all available information, imposed a sentence of 30 years in prison. 30 years. For an 11-month-old child who had no capacity to understand what was happening, who had no ability to call for help, who depended entirely on the adults in his life for his safety. 30 years is the legal system's acknowledgement that his life had value and that what was done to him demanded a consequence commensurate with the gravity of the act. Medical professionals who work in pediatric emergency settings have spoken about the importance of mandatory reporting requirements and of training that helps healthcare providers recognize the signs of non-accidental injury in young children. That training, that protocol, that willingness to make the call to law enforcement when something does not look right, those things made a difference in this case. They ensured that investigators became aware of what had happened and that the evidence was preserved and documented in a way that ultimately supported the prosecution. The child at the center of this case deserved more days. He deserved the chance to walk, to talk, to run in a Nashville park on a summer evening. The 30-year sentence imposed by the Davidson County Court is the legal system's statement on his behalf, a statement that his 11 months mattered, that what was done to him was wrong, and that accountability is not negotiable. If this case reminded you of why this kind of documentary work matters, please hit the like button, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share this video with someone you know. Your engagement helps us keep telling stories that deserve to be heard. Case 8, Latonia Maria Gardner. December 7, 2016. Davidson County Criminal Court, Nashville. The name Jacoby Gardner appears in Davidson County court records as the name of a 4-year-old boy whose death, in December of 2016, became the basis for one of the most serious criminal cases prosecuted in Nashville in the years that followed. His case involves 2 defendants, his mother, Latonia Maria Gardner, and her husband, and it involves a course of conduct that investigators and prosecutors characterized in terms that placed it among the gravest cases of child abuse and neglect that the Davidson County system had processed in recent memory. Jacoby was 4 years old. For is the age of wonder, the age of endless questions, the age at which children are discovering the world in a way that is both exhausting and extraordinary for the adults around them. It is also an age at which children are beginning to develop the language and the awareness to describe their experiences, to say when they are hurting, to reach for help when they need it. Jacoby's ability to do those things, to communicate his experience to anyone who might have intervened, was constrained by the environment in which he lived. The investigation into Jacoby's death, conducted by Nashville Metropolitan Police Department detectives working with Davidson County prosecutors, established a picture of his life in the period leading up to December 7, 2016, that was deeply troubling. The findings pointed to a pattern of severe physical abuse and prolonged medical neglect that had not occurred over a matter of days, but over an extended period. Jacoby had not been receiving the medical attention that his condition required. He had been subjected to physical harm that left marks on his body that investigators documented carefully and that medical professionals interpreted with professional certainty. The role of both defendants in what had happened to Jacoby was examined through the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. Latonia Maria Gardner, as Jacoby's mother, bore the primary legal duty of care toward him. The evidence established that she had not fulfilled that duty, not in the provision of medical care, not in the protection of her child from physical harm, and not in the basic obligations of parenting that the law recognizes and enforces. The case moved through Davidson County's legal system with the kind of deliberate, methodical pace that complex multi-defendant cases require. Both defendants faced serious charges. Both were subject to the full weight of the prosecution that the evidence supported. The proceedings involved the careful presentation of medical testimony, investigative findings, and the documentation of Jacoby's circumstances in a manner that built a thorough and comprehensive case. In April of 2022, more than 5 years after Jacoby's death, the court rendered its judgment on Latonia Maria Gardner. She was sentenced to life in prison on charges of felony murder and aggravated child abuse. The sentence is among the most serious that the Davidson County court system can impose, and its imposition reflected the court's assessment of the gravity and duration of the conduct that had led to Jacoby's death. Life in prison. For a 4-year-old boy who deserved the entirety of what life had to offer him. The years of growing up, of school and friendships and Nashville summers, and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments of a life lived fully. The legal outcome is the system's acknowledgement that what happened to him was not just a tragedy. It was a crime. And crimes of this nature demand the accountability that this sentence represents. Davidson County's child advocacy and legal communities have pointed to cases like Jacoby's as evidence of the ongoing need for community-based child welfare monitoring and for systems that identify children who may be at risk before the worst outcomes occur. Home visitation programs, community health workers, and school-based observation protocols are among the tools that child welfare professionals cite as critical to the early identification of children in dangerous situations. Jacoby Gardner deserved better. He deserved every resource, every intervention, every watchful neighbor, and caring professional that a community can offer a vulnerable child. The life sentence imposed in April of 2022 is the legal system's recognition of what was taken from him. The larger work of ensuring that fewer children find themselves in the circumstances Jacoby faced belongs to all of us. Please like this video, leave a comment for Jacoby and for all the children in tonight's documentary, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories deserve witnesses. Case 9, Tabitha Ward. October 31st, 2024. Davidson County Criminal Court, Nashville. The case of Tabitha Ward sits at the intersection of two separate but deeply connected concerns that have occupied Nashville law enforcement, community advocates, and policy discussions for years. The first is the issue of illegal firearms in the hands of individuals who are legally prohibited from possessing them. The second is the devastating consequences that can follow when those weapons become accessible to young people in the home. In the Ward case, these two concerns collided on Halloween night of 2024 with results that were both legally significant and personally catastrophic. Halloween, October 31st. In Nashville, as in communities across the country, that evening would typically be associated with children in costumes, with neighborhoods lit by porch lights, with the kind of communal celebration that marks the autumn calendar. In a Davidson County home that evening, something entirely different was unfolding. Tabitha Ward was a convicted felon. Her status as a convicted felon meant that under both federal and Tennessee state law, she was legally prohibited from possessing firearms. This is not a technical or obscure provision of the law. It is among the most clearly established and widely known restrictions in the entire framework of firearms regulations. A felony conviction removes the legal right to possess a weapon. That prohibition is not conditional. It does not depend on circumstance or time elapsed since the conviction. It is absolute. Despite that prohibition, investigators allege that Tabitha Ward had 6 firearms inside her Davidson County home. 6 weapons, in the residence of a person legally barred from possessing a single one. The presence of those weapons in that home created an environment that, on the evening of October 31st, 2024, had catastrophic consequences. Ward's 15-year-old son gained access to one of those weapons. And in circumstances that investigators documented in the subsequent investigation, the 15-year-old used that weapon to take his own life. The loss of a 15-year-old in that manner, in circumstances that were entirely the product of choices made by the adult responsible for the safety of that home, is a tragedy that sits at the center of this case, and that cannot be addressed by any legal outcome, however serious. What investigators allege happened next is what elevated this case from a devastating family tragedy into a serious criminal matter involving active obstruction of the investigative process. According to the charges filed against Tabitha Ward, after her son's death, she took the firearms that had been in the home, the 6 weapons whose illegal presence had made this night possible, and concealed them in a backpack. The alleged purpose of this concealment was to prevent law enforcement from discovering that she had possessed the weapons illegally when they arrived to investigate her son's death. The investigation conducted by Nashville Metropolitan Police Department detectives unraveled the alleged concealment relatively quickly. The evidence of what had been in the home, and of what had been done with that evidence after law enforcement became involved, was documented and preserved. In November of 2024, within weeks of the events of Halloween night, Tabitha Ward was arrested. The charges filed against her were extensive, 21 separate charges. The charges included criminally negligent homicide, connecting her son's death to the circumstances she allegedly created through the illegal possession of those weapons. They also included charges related to evidence tampering, the alleged concealment of the firearms in the backpack, and they included multiple counts related to the illegal possession of each individual weapon found in the home. 21 charges. The breadth of the charging document reflects the multiple layers of legal responsibility that prosecutors identified in Ward's conduct. Not just a single act, but a pattern of decisions that began with the possession of illegal weapons, continued through the circumstances that made those weapons accessible to a teenager in the home, and allegedly extended into active efforts to obstruct the investigation after the worst had already occurred. As of the production of this documentary, the case of Tabitha Ward is pending in Davidson County. The charges are serious, the evidence is documented, and the legal process is moving forward in the manner that Tennessee's court system requires. The presumption of innocence applies, as it must, to the charges that remain to be adjudicated. The full resolution of this case will come through the court proceedings that lie ahead. What is not pending, what is not in question, and what requires no legal proceeding to establish, is the loss of a 15-year-old boy, a teenager who had his entire life ahead of him. A young man who should have been out on Halloween night doing what 15-year-olds do, not at home in a house where illegal weapons were accessible and where the circumstances that followed have left a family and a community changed forever. Gun safety advocates and child protection professionals have long cited the importance of secure firearm storage as a critical component of home safety, particularly in homes where young people are present. The presence of unsecured firearms in a home with minors dramatically increases the risk of accidental injury and of the kind of tragedy that occurred in this case. Organizations including Everytown for Gun Safety and the American Academy of Pediatrics have resources available for families on safe storage practices. For the 15-year-old at the center of this case, a young man who deserved better, who deserved the protection of a safe home and of an adult making lawful choices on his behalf, the legal proceedings now underway in Davidson County are the system's response to what happened. It is a response that will take time, but it will come. If this case raised important questions for you about gun safety, child protection, and accountability, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These conversations matter, and your engagement helps keep them going. Case 10, Priscila Mota. December 12, 2022. Davidson County Criminal Court, Nashville. The final case in tonight's Cold Case Hour documentary returns to Nashville's Davidson County, to a medical facility, and to the moment when healthcare professionals, trained to distinguish between the injuries of accident and the injuries of intent, encountered a 9-month-old child whose condition raised questions that could not be left unanswered. December 12, 2022. A Nashville hospital receives a child. The child is 9 months old, a girl. She is brought in unresponsive by her mother, Priscila Mota. The medical team that receives this infant immediately recognizes the severity of what they are seeing. Their assessment documents multiple skull fractures and a brain bleed, injuries whose nature and pattern the medical professionals who examined her were trained to evaluate and to interpret. 9 months old. A child at that age has crossed certain developmental thresholds. She is perhaps beginning to sit up, beginning to recognize voices, beginning to engage with the world in ways that are visible to the people around her. She is no longer a newborn, but she remains profoundly vulnerable, profoundly dependent, and profoundly unable to protect herself from harm. Her entire world is defined by the adults in it. When investigators arrived to speak with Priscila Mota about the circumstances that had led to the child being brought to the hospital in her condition, they received an explanation. Mota indicated that the infant had fallen from a bed. It is an explanation that investigators and medical professionals hear with some regularity in cases involving injured young children, and one that medical and forensic professionals are specifically trained to evaluate against the physical evidence. Falls from standard bed heights are extensively studied in pediatric medicine. The injury patterns they produce are known and documented. What those studies consistently show is that the kinds of injuries documented in this case, multiple skull fractures, internal bleeding in the brain, are not consistent with the physics of a fall from a bed. The medical professionals who examined this child were not uncertain in their assessment. The injuries they documented were consistent with severe physical force that significantly exceeded what any household accident of the type described could account for. Their findings were documented and communicated to law enforcement in the manner that mandatory reporting requirements demand and that professional ethics require. The investigation that followed built a case around the medical evidence, the timeline of events, and the circumstances surrounding the child's care in the period before she arrived at the hospital. Priscila Mota was charged with attempted criminal homicide and aggravated child abuse in connection with the injuries her daughter had sustained. The charge of attempted criminal homicide reflects that the 9-month-old girl, unlike several of the children whose stories are told earlier in tonight's documentary, survived. She was injured, seriously, significantly, with injuries whose effects may be felt across the arc of her life, but she survived. Survival in these circumstances is not simply a medical fact. It is a legal and human one as well. The fact that this child lived means that somewhere, as this documentary is produced, there is a little girl who was 9 months old on December 12, 2022, who is now older, who is growing, who is developing in ways that the people who care for her are watching and supporting and nurturing. Whatever challenges she may face as a result of what happened to her, she is present. She is here. And the legal proceedings underway in Davidson County on her behalf represent the system's commitment to accountability for what she endured. As of the production of this documentary, the case of Priscila Mota is pending trial in Davidson County. The charges are filed. The evidence has been preserved and documented. The legal process is moving forward. Cold Case Hour will monitor this case and provide updates as the proceedings develop and as the court reaches its conclusions. The use of medical evidence in cases involving injured children is one of the most powerful tools available to the criminal justice system. The collaboration between healthcare professionals and law enforcement, the trained eyes of medical providers, the mandatory reporting obligations that connect hospitals to investigative agencies, and the forensic expertise that allows medical findings to be translated into legal evidence, is a system that, when it functions as intended, protects children who cannot protect themselves. In this case, that system worked. The medical professionals recognized what they were seeing. The report was made. The investigation was launched. The charges were filed. The process is moving forward. For a 9-month-old child who could not call for help and who depended entirely on the adults around her, that system was the only protection available. It responded. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, available at 1-800-422-4453, accepts calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and connects callers with crisis intervention, information, and referrals to local emergency, social service, and support resources. If you have concerns about a child's safety, that call could make all the difference. Davidson County's court system will have the final word on the case of Priscila Mota. That word will come in time, through the process that Tennessee's justice system provides. And when it does, Cold Case Hour will be here to tell you about it. Tonight's documentary has taken us through 10 cases, 10 stories involving children who were harmed, who were failed, who lost their lives, or were forever changed by the actions of the adults most responsible for their safety. These are not easy stories. They are not meant to be. They are told here because they deserve to be told, because the children at their center deserve to be remembered, because the communities affected deserve to understand what happened, and because awareness, education, and accountability are among the most powerful tools we have in the ongoing work of child protection. The legal system, as you have seen tonight, is not perfect. It moves slowly. It demands evidence. It requires time. But it also delivers accountability, sometimes quickly, sometimes after years of patient investigation and litigation. And that accountability matters. It matters to the families of victims. It matters to the communities that were affected. And it matters to the broader conversation about how we protect the most vulnerable among us. If tonight's documentary moved you, if it strengthened your commitment to child safety and to the communities where you live, please consider reaching out to a local child advocacy organization, learning more about mandatory reporting requirements in your state, or simply being the kind of neighbor, colleague, and community member who pays attention and asks questions when something does not seem right. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453. The National Parent Helpline, 1-800-243-7337. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services, 1-877-542-5437. These resources exist because help is available, because the right choice even in the hardest moments, is always to reach out. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary mattered to you, please like this video, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new episode. Share this documentary with someone who needs to hear these stories. Your support makes this work possible, and these stories deserve every witness they can find. Justice is not always fast, but it is always worth fighting for.